1 Corinthians. We're going to start with the exercise on slide 1. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 10 to 17. Based on this passage, why do you think Paul is writing this letter? Please pause the video at this point to complete the exercise. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 10 to 17. Based on this passage, why do you think Paul is writing this letter? Well, these verses describe what was happening in the Corinthian church, and therefore at least part of why Paul was writing this letter to them. Paul urges the Corinthian Christians to agree with one another in what they say and to have no divisions among themselves. That's in verse 10. He urges them to be perfectly united in mind and thought. Well, clearly they were disagreeing with one another and they were divided. That's what he makes clear in verse 11. He says he's been informed by some from Chloe's household that there were quarrels among them. Some were claiming to be followers of Paul, verse 12. Others followers of Apollos. Others Cephas, that's Peter. And yet others followers of Christ. In verse 13, Paul asks 3 questions that were all meant to be answered with an emphatic no. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? Paul can't remember exactly who he's baptized in Corinth, verses 14 to 16, beyond a handful of people, Crispus, Gaius, and the household of Stephanus. But it was good that not many had been baptized by him, so that people couldn't say that they had been baptized in Paul's name rather than in Jesus' name. He reminds the Corinthians that Christ did not send him to baptize, verse 17, but rather to preach the gospel. And so Paul writes his letter to the Corinthians against this backdrop of division and disunity and disagreement. As you read these letters to the Corinthians, you'll see time and time again that Paul is writing to a troubled church. Introducing 1 Corinthians. At the end of his second missionary journey, Paul visited the Greek city of Corinth. Corinth was a place that had become infamous for its immorality. Acts tells us that Paul stayed there in Corinth doing ministry for about 1.5 years. And during that time, his preaching led to the conversion of both Jews and Gentiles, and the church there in Corinth was formed. But as Paul writes this letter, it's during his third missionary journey, during his almost 3-year stay in Ephesus. And he's been made aware of some big problems in the Corinthian church. He's also been sent a letter from the church with a number of questions. And so Paul writes this letter that has become known as 1 Corinthians probably early in AD 55. In this letter, Paul answers the Corinthian Christians' questions about sex and marriage, chapter 7, about food offered to idols, chapter 8. But much of this letter is taken up with the problems of the church. He deals with deep divisions in the church in chapters 1 to 4. He deals with immoral behaviour, incest and prostitution, and Christians taking one another's accord in chapters 5 to 6. He writes about problems in the conduct of the church, abuse of the Lord's Supper, chapter 11, and the abuse of spiritual gifts in chapters 12 to 14. He also deals with wrong doctrine in chapter 15. Some in the church, it seems, were denying the doctrine of the future resurrection of believers. And in chapter 9, Paul also feels the need to defend himself against personal criticism. Criticism about the way he financed his ministry when he was with them in Corinth. Paul is still actively collecting money at this point in his ministry for the poor Christians in Jerusalem. And so as he closes his letter, he ends with a plea to the Corinthians to give to the poor, and also a promise that he'll visit them. Interestingly, 1 Corinthians 5 verse 9 refers to a previous letter that Paul has written to the Corinthians, a letter that's not been preserved for us. At the heart of this letter is the good news of Jesus that Paul preached. That's what he writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 to 2. He says this, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you have received and on which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain." At the end of your notes, please notice a possible outline of 1 Corinthians.